Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
All right, we're getting started. We are again virtual. Talked to the brother PJ last night. They're still doing some final touches on the studio. So hopefully we'll be back there next week. We'll see how it goes. But he said it's in the final stages, so we'll see how it goes. And I'm really excited because we're going to have a whole new look, and it's going to be very well done. So we are in session 3 of our Sheroes course. We're going to do a little bit of a review from where we were last week, and we have a lot to discuss this week. We're going to spend a lot of time in South America today and in the Caribbean. We'll touch on North America a little bit, but right now we're moving the resistance from on the continent to in the Americas during the period of enslavement and seeing how African women led these resistance movements. So as always, I'll lecture for about 25-30 minutes. We'll have a break in the middle for Q&A. Then I'll do another 25-30 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A and open discussion at the end. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, so let's jump back into it. Session 3, what we're going to review last week, like I mentioned, and then we're going to talk about African women-led resistance movements in the Americas, with a focus on South America this week, and we'll touch on some of the Caribbean. Next week, we'll do more on the Caribbean, and then we'll also talk about North America in more detail next week. So we spent the majority of our class last week talking about Queen Njinga and Bandi of the Kingdom of Ndongo and what was going on in her region of the world. The interesting thing about that is so many Africans from this region of the world that we discussed last week, from Queen Nzinga to even Kimpa Vita from the Congo, so many of those Africans made their way to South America. Africans that were involved in civil wars and wars between nations in Africa and kingdoms in Africa that were often instigated by mostly the Portuguese, Spanish a little bit, but mostly the Portuguese. And we'll get into why it was them. And they made their way to places like Brazil, which we talked about last week when we talked about the establishment of quilombos and mucambos in Brazil. Today, okay, I'll use the horse for a second. I got to teach. We're going to focus more so on the Spanish controlled areas in the Americas and not on Brazil, because we talked about Brazil last week. So again, just to orient ourselves geographically, this was the region that we discussed last week. When we talked about Ndongo, we're talking about what's now Angola and a little bit of Congo. When we talk about the Kingdom of Congo, we're talking about modern day Congo, a little bit of Angola, actually a lot of Angola. This is the region that these Africans were coming from that ended up in the part of the Americas that we're going to discuss. For the bulk of them. They also came from other areas in Africa, like Guinea, like Southwest Nigeria, Senegal, etc. But in the time period that we're going to be discussing, the late 1500s into the 1600s, this is the area that we're going to spend a lot of time discussing. So keep in mind all of the political dynamics that we talked about last week, the role of spirituality in struggle, the long-standing role of Africanized Catholicism in the region, because that plays a role in what happens in the Americas. The important thing to remember is these Africans coming from this region are not blank slates. They're coming with political experience, military experience, spiritual experiences that they bring over to the Americas, and they remix it and reformat it for their new social conditions. And one of those things that they carry over is the idea that women can lead both spiritually, politically, and militarily. And this is an idea that they bring with them from all parts of West and Central Africa. So, our evidence for this week, and I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the secondary evidence and where you can find it. And a lot of it is posted on our course website. Some of the documents are in Spanish. A lot of them are in Spanish, and some of them I've been able to find English translations. So you can see both of those. If you speak Spanish, you'll see a good amount of Spanish documents on our course website that you can use. But for today, we're going to be looking at Spanish, French, and English colonial sources, particularly interrogations and trial records. One thing you'll notice, and I talked about this a little bit in the Snitches and Sellouts course, whenever there was a rebellion against enslavement, whether it actually succeeded, whether it was snuffed out before it could begin, there was always an interrogation and a trial of the enslaved Africans that participated or who were thought to have participated. In order for the colonial authorities to figure out how this happened, who were the main players, how can we stop this from happening again, what are some of the patterns we could suss out from these experiences. And they kept all those records. They kept all of those interrogation records and trial records, or a lot of them. And we still have them. And we'll talk about where those are found and how historians get access to them and how we can use them to figure out the role of African women. Because you remember, the Africans are giving their testimony under interrogation and during these experiences, but the ultimate transcriber are Europeans. So when they write down these records, it's not always verbatim. They give their own spin on things sometimes, or they give their own interpretation of events in some cases. And oftentimes, what is deemed valuable for them to record is not necessarily the things that we would like. So they leave out the role of women a lot, or they will do things like refer to spiritual practices as witchcraft or these types of things, or they'll embellish things and to try to show the quote unquote savage nature of the Africans. So they'll include things like cannibalism and others. Get out of it. Excuse me, one second. All right, saw something in my backyard. Okay, so the other source, the primary source that we'll talk about is the oral history. So when we get into the second part of the class, we'll talk about Jamaican Maroon history, oral history. More so, this is actually for both this week and next week, but we'll talk about Haitian oral history, written history, as well as African American oral history and Ghanaian oral history as well. So this covers both this week and next week, and I'll touch on this again next week. All right, so again, just a map. We began last week talking about the trade to the east. Now we're talking about the trade to the west. And again, one of the main differences is the gender ratio of each trade. The trade to the east that went to the Arab world, it was a higher ratio of women that went that way. To the west, different story. The latest figure I saw somewhere around for every 4 Africans, only 1 was a woman that was taken to the Americas during the time from the end of the beginning of the 16th century to the end of the 19th century. For that 400-year period, the bulk of the people taken were African men. I did see another very interesting statistic that I'm kind of hesitant to bring up because I need to double check if it's actually accurate or not. I was actually in one of the readings that I looked at to get ready for today. And it said that according to the database on the shipment of enslaved Africans to the Americas. So there is a database that is currently being updated, constantly being updated, which looks at the records, the ship records of where they got Africans on the continent, where they disembarked in the Americas, and that database is being updated. And it also talks about the revolts on the ships in those places. So one of the things that's brought up is if a slave ship, or let me say it like this, according to this author, and again, I have to verify this, the higher the amount of women on a vessel, the more likely the chance of a revolt on the ship. Again, I'm putting that out there because I read it, but I'm going to verify that and give you a more definitive answer. But it's just something that I saw that people that are going through the data right now are seeing as a pattern, that the higher the percentage of women on the slave vessel, the more likely the chance for an on the sea revolt. So that's really interesting. And again, that's a new idea that's being put out. So the reasons for that was it the women, having the desire to fight more than the men? Is it that reason? Is it the fact that the men on the ship are seeing how the women are being treated, and that is an extra impetus to revolt on the ship? It's unclear. So I'll by the time we get done with this course, I'll probably have a more definitive answer on that, because I want to check where that historian got the source from. But it's a really interesting thing to think about. But in any event, that was the ratio, 3 to 1, 3 African men for every African woman. And when they get to the Americas, both men and women resist. They resist slavery in various ways. We're going to talk about today the Spanish version, or it's the African, it just ends the Spanish territories. But in Brazil, they were called quilombos, the Central African term meaning war camp. In the Spanish colonies, communities of free Africans were known as maroon communities, from the word cimarron. But in particular, in South America, in Venezuela, in Colombia, they're known as palenques. Palenques. It's the same phenomena as a quilombo or a mucambo or any community, even if it gets to the point of a nation of independent Africans that had escaped enslavement and developed their own countries. That's what they were called. Quilombos, palenques, mucambos, maroon communities is all the same phenomena. In fact, the English would take the Spanish word cimarron and turn that into maroon communities. So in Jamaica, in the United States, you have the term maroons in the English-speaking places. Even in Haiti, I think they use some form of maroon, but they also use cambe in different terms as well. All right, so one of the key secondary sources that you can use if you want to get more in depth on this is the Orality, Identity, and Resistance in Palenque. This is focusing on Colombia. It's an edited text by scholars Armin Swelger, Brian Kirshen, and Garcella Maglia. And one of the key articles in this book is chapter 6, Palenques, Maroons, and Castas in Colombia's Caribbean regions. Because if you look at Colombia, Colombia has a Pacific coast and also has a Caribbean coast. And Africans were present on both coasts, but more so in the Caribbean section of Colombia. And this is where we see a lot of the Palenques, the maroon communities. And these folks are still very much alive. Their descendants are still very much alive. And they're referred to as Palenqueras. This is a statue in the city of Cartagena, which is actually funny because the city of Cartagena is the Spanish way of pronouncing Carthage, which is in North Africa. So when the Spanish came to Colombia, they named this city after Carthage because they wanted it to be a great trading center for their American empire that was going to stretch all the way from North America to South America. Let me go back a little bit further. In the 1400s, after Columbus gets to the Americas in the name of the Spanish, the major powers in Europe that are navigating both in Africa and in the Americas are the Spanish and the Portuguese. So they go to the Pope to essentially divide the world, this new world that they're finding. And the Pope makes this division. He draws this line. It's called the Treaty of Tordesillas. The line is drawn, and the Portuguese get Brazil, and the Spanish get everything west of Brazil, including North America, Central America, the Caribbean, and the rest of South America. Now, of course, the other European powers eventually don't honor this, and Spanish territory, particularly in North America, becomes up for grabs. But that was the original division. And also with that division, the Portuguese got everything east, including any colonies they set up in Africa. So from around 1490, from that Treaty of Tordesillas, I think it was 1494. I got to go back to see what the year for that treaty was. But since then, when the Spanish wanted labor for their colonies in the Caribbean, in Mexico, and in New Granada is what they called it, which was Colombia, Venezuela, what will become Ecuador, Peru. They initially turned to the indigenous people, as we mentioned before. That didn't work out, so they needed to get Africans. They did have a supply of Africans known as Ladinos. These were Africans that had been enslaved in Spain proper, in Spain, and off the coast of Africa and in the Mediterranean. But in order to get more Africans directly from the continent, the Spanish had to get them from the Portuguese. So the Spanish, as well as later on the English and the Dutch and the French, many of the Africans they procured on the continent in the early part of the enslavement period, they had to get them from the Portuguese and not directly. They didn't have any presence on the African coast themselves. So for many of the Africans that came to New Spain, that came to New Granada and these places, and Colombia, which will be the city of Cartagena, they came from the places that the Portuguese had access to in Africa. What's now Ghana, what's now Nigeria. They had trade relationships with Nigeria, what's now the Republic of Benin, which was the Kingdom of Dahomey, and of course, Angola and Congo, which we talked about last week. So many of those Africans are coming from those cultural centers. The ones that escaped, they formed palenques, and this symbol, the statue that you see on the right, is the statue of the palenquera. It's not a particular woman, it's a representation of all the African women that resisted enslavement in Colombia, that helped form these communities and help defend these communities. So if you go to Cartagena today, you can see this statue there, and it represents these women's struggle. The actual name of the statue is La Palenquera, or the woman of the Palenque. So you can visit that today if you go there. Anyway, in terms of primary sources, this book that was done in, I think, the 80s by Carmen Barrero Pla is called Cartagena of the Indies in the 16th century. That's what that says in Spanish. What she did, she looked at the colonial records, and I'll tell you exactly where those are from. In fact, what I'm going to do, the text on the top is where a lot of this information comes from. This was or still exists, you can read it. It's a 900-page document called Testimony of the Trials and Punishments that were carried out by the Maestro de Campo Francisco de Morga, Governor and Captain General of Cartagena, against the rebellious Black Maroons of the Palenques of Limon, Polin, and Zanaguare. This is a document, again, that all of those investigations, all of those interrogations of those Africans after these rebellions were fought, you can go and you can read it. There's also archives in Spain, in Seville. I think this one might actually be in Cartagena. But if you go to the archives in Spain, they have records about what was going on in the 1500s, in the 1600s, in Colombia and in Venezuela, and you can go and read those and see what Africans were up to. So there's no dearth of primary sources that talk about what these Africans were up to and how women played a key role. So let me go back. So this one in particular, this book is in Spanish. It's really hard to find, but other more recent scholars who are particularly looking for the role of African women, because we also have to remember in scholarship, unfortunately, even when these archives are used for a lot of the 20th century, much of the focus when people thought about the rebellions of enslaved people, they thought about African men. They weren't looking for African women, or they weren't even, considering the role of African women. So more recent scholars have. This is an article from 2023, Women in the Geographies of Maroonage, Territorial Intimacy as Freedom Strategy, the case of Maria de los Santos and her bonga, by Ana Laura Zavilla Guillen, who is a Peruvian scholar. But she writes this, which comes out of this book. So this author is citing this book, which got their information from the archive, those testimonies. And it says this, Maria de la Carmen Barreo Pla narrates the leadership of one Polonia. So this African woman's name was Polonia, in a palenque that threatened lodging and trade through the Magdalena River in around 1570. In 1581, the palenque fiercely resisted colonial mercenaries with a defense that included 150 female warriors. Almost defeated, the mercenaries negotiated a truce with Polonia. The Maroons could obtain land and freedom if they abandoned their insurgents. The colonials did not keep their promise. Of course, settler colonies of all kinds, they never keep their promises. We know that. The colonists did not keep their promise and sold the recaptured Maroons, but compensated the surviving Maroon leaders, including Polonia. So this is really interesting. 150 female warriors in 1581. 150 female warriors, probably coming from, again, Angola, Congo region, based on the time period. And this is 1581. So this is the same year that Spain and Portugal actually became a united kingdom for a while. I think it lasted from, I want to say 1580 to 1630, there was a united Spanish and Portuguese empire. So instead of being rivals against each other, they were a united kingdom. And which, as a result, made it easier for the Spanish to acquire Africans from Central Africa to work in the mines and on the plantations in the Americas. So you have an influx during this time period of Africans into the Spanish colonies, even more because it's easier to procure them. So you got these Africans and these women coming from Central and other parts of West Africa. They get to Colombia and they're fighting. They're fighting. So we see it. The first instance of them is in 1570, where they're disrupting logging activities and other things in this region. But then when the Spanish actually send a force against them in 1581, they hold their own against the Spanish. 150 female warriors. That can't be something that we just gloss over. That is an amazing number, considering the demographics that I mentioned earlier, that it was 3 men for every 1 woman taken into the Americas. So the fact that you have 150 free African women fighting as warriors against the Spanish, fighting so well that the Spanish are forced to negotiate a truce. They couldn't completely defeat these people. And even when the Spanish broke the truce, they sold the ones that they were able to capture, but they had to compensate the leader of the community, Pelona. So they're paying this African woman that runs this community. If there's 150 female warriors, then we can, extrapolate that there's a whole lot more people that aren't fighting, that are taking care of elderly folks and children. So this is just the fighting force. So this is a large community that Polonia, which is the Spanish name, is overseeing. So really important that these archives show this, and these are things that we should be telling our children all the time, that yes, there was a place in the Americas where you had a force of 150 African women warriors that fought for their own freedom. Really important. Other sources, if another article that I've also linked on the website is called Contested Rituals, Spanish Colonial and Angolan Maroon Executions in Cartagena de Indias. And this is a little while later. This is in 1634. So again, whenever these communities existed all around, basically surrounding the town of Cartagena, which was the port town. This is where all the ships came into, and it was going to be the Spanish's, again, their new Carthage, their new great trading area. So merchandise as well as enslaved Africans came into this town, and when they got there, many of them escaped and formed these communities, and one community would be defeated and another one would pop up. So around the same time that they're fighting in the region that Polonia is in, there's another queen named Queen Leonor. Leonor Criolla, and the last names say a lot because usually the last names of enslaved or free African people at this time represent where they come from. So when you see the name Criollo, that means she was actually born in the in Colombia, what would become Colombia. She was born in the Americas, but her father was from Angola. We know that from the testimony. She was the queen of the Palenque of Limon, and it's really interesting because she was initiated as queen. She was chosen as queen. Again, at this time, more and more Africans are coming from Central Africa, and two Africans, these Angolans and Malimbas and Angolans, meaning they're from Central Africa, they come to this already settled Palenque of Limon, and they come there after they've escaped enslavement right from Africa, and they are incorporated into the community, which already had people from Angola, people from Congo, and descendants of people from Angola and Congo who all speak the language. And once they got there, they helped initiate Leonor into her position as queen. And it says in the record, the arrival of all these new settlers to Limon brought about behavioral changes for the runaway Creoles and the Maroons, as well as for its political structure and social organization. Malimbas and Angolans provoked Maroons and Creoles to attack the farms to secure more soldiers. The same attacks were also aimed at obtaining more people to work in the fields and, again, increasing the number of women, which is, really important. Sebastian Congo, you see his last name Congo, means he's probably from Congo. Cristobal, Anton, and Francisco Malimbas, meaning these folks are Malimbas, that's their nation in Africa, inflicted some sort of witchcraft on the Black Lenore, according to the archives. Apparently, this was a concoction that made her crazy from the viewpoint of the Spanish. The Malimbas and Angolans aligned with her, and from that point forward, she began to reign over their Palenque, calling her queen despite the fact that Francisco Criollo continued as captain. Leonor and Francisco Criollo communicated with one another in their own language. So this says a lot, this short passage. According from the Spanish viewpoint, they inflicted some sort of witchcraft that made her crazy. But if you're looking at it from an African spiritual standpoint, what probably happened is she was elected queen. She was initiated the same way they do initiation ceremonies in Central Africa, in Quilombos in Central Africa, the same way Queen Njinga would be a couple decades later initiated into the Mbangala. And she probably went under the way it's described by the Spanish, it sounds like she was under a spiritual possession the same way as someone like King Pavita or others. It's not unheard of for African political leaders to also be spiritual leaders. And we know from the study of African spirituality that possession and being mounted by Orisha and other spirits and is part and parcel of what it is. So for the Spanish to say it made her crazy, why would Africans elect a crazy person as their queen? It's only crazy because you're looking at it from the viewpoint of the Spanish. It would be like if someone looked at the practices of somebody didn't know any better, and they looked at the practices of the Pentecostal church in some of these places. You would look at some of those people catching the Holy Ghost. You would say, those people are crazy. What are they doing? Speaking in tongues and doing all that. So it's the same thing. It's all about the vantage point of the people recording the archive. But we know better. So she's elected queen. She leads this Palenque of Limon and leads it for a long time. In fact, she and her forces engage in a number of battles against the Spanish. In one of them, they capture a guy that betrayed them. So one thing about these Palenques, they weren't completely isolated. So they were these large communities, hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, and they traded with indigenous people in the region, poor whites in the region, and others. So until the Spanish felt that they were strong enough to actually militarily confront them, oftentimes these places engaged in peace. There was a Quilombo peace that Beatriz Nascimento talks about, where Africans got the opportunity to breathe and engage in agriculture and trade and new forms of political and social organization. One of the interesting things about Leonor, which is something that we also see in that we know about that occurred in the Maroon communities in Suriname, she had two husbands. she had two husbands. There was polyandry going on in a lot of these quilombos. Again, let's go back to the ratio: 3 men for every 1 woman. So in the early stages, in a lot of these quilombos and palenques and maroon communities, women would often have two husbands, and this queen had two husbands. I think one of his name was, it wasn't this Francisco, it was another Francisco and somebody else. So that's not unheard of. And we even, this again, it was observed in the Maroons in Suriname. It probably exists in other places as well before they were able to procreate naturally and have enough people that the gender balance would be, what it was. So they had to adapt these new social structures, new familiar structures. These were multi-ethnic, as you can see. These communities included Africans from Congo, from Angola, from parts of West Africa that's now Nigeria and Guinea and Dahomey and Ghana. And then, of course, you had the Africans that were born there, that are the children of folks coming directly from Africa. And they're able to speak their own language and do things. But they also have elements of the Spanish culture and even indigenous culture that they were able to pick up and mold together as they create these new realities. Another one, and it's amazing and we're only talking about Colombia. Everything that we've mentioned is all around the city of Cartagena. These different communities that would be attacked and new ones would pop up. And again, their descendants are still around today. Oh, let me go back actually. What happened to Limon? The Spanish ultimately attack Limon. They capture a number of the leaders, hang and behead a number of the leaders. Not sure what happened to Queen Leonor. Many of the leaders were exiled to other places. Because it doesn't say that she was hung when they named the people that were hung. So she may have been exiled to another thing, or she possibly could have died in battle. It's really unclear what happens to her. But really important. And one of the other episodes that we have of her in terms of her power as queen, going back to the Palenque being betrayed by this poor white pig farmer who they were dealing with, who they were trading with. Then they got word that he was conspiring with the Spanish to help the Spanish to, form a force to attack them. Well, they found out about him. They kidnapped him and his son, and they brought them back to the Palenque, and they were executed by her. She's the one that they put the two prisoners on the ground on their side, and she cut their heads off. That was her asserting her authority over life and death in the Palenque and putting out that punishment for those that betrayed. So really important. Another leader, Juana, the queen or vice queen of Matadere. She was the ruler of this Palenque called Matadere, and she took the title Verena. She actually was captured and interrogated, and when she was asked these questions by the Spanish colonial officials, she said, "This is my position. I was the founder of this Palenque, and I'm the vice queen, or the viceroy, essentially, of this nation." And again, just like Limon, it was a multi-ethnic Palenque. You had Africans from all over West and Central Africa that were there in 1675. The Spanish knew about the existence of this Palenque. Again, they knew about these places, but they couldn't do anything about them until they had enough forces they felt they were capable enough to actually make an attack. But at first, they tried to use soft diplomacy against this Palenque led by Juana. So they sent in a priest to negotiate with them, it's almost like to get intelligence. So the priest comes. He comes into the Palenque and he writes his observations. He said, wow, they have crops, they have agriculture, they engage in trade, and they even have a church. That's important. It's significant because they had a church because many of these Africans came from Congo, which had been Christian for, at this point, almost 200 years. Well, at least the ruling class in Congo, and it spread into the regular people. And we talked about Kimpa Vita and others. So when the priest gets there, he sees a church and he sees the Africans doing catechisms and these things. Not everybody. Some are practicing traditional African religions. Some people have incorporated indigenous beliefs into what they're doing and so on. But it just goes to show that these communities weren't monoliths. You got multiple languages being spoken. You got multiple religions being practiced. But one of the things that you see in all of them, there is usually some space for women to lead, whether as queens or founders in their own right or alongside their husbands, because they're modeling what is going on in Africa. You very rarely have a political unit, whether it's a kingdom or or even a semi-democracy, that doesn't have a place for female rulers, either as queen or queen mother or something of the like. So they're just taking what they were doing in Africa and remixing it in the Americas. So after that priest came, I think maybe a month after that priest came and made his observations, the Spanish decided to send a force against her. And they sent 60 men against her, and they were utterly defeated. Her forces used guerrilla tactics. They defeated these 60 Spanish troops that were sent against them, and they took their weapons, which is a key thing in guerrilla warfare. When you kill the enemy, you strip the enemy. You take their weapons, you take all that, and to reinforce your own troops. So that's what she did. And when I say her strategies included African humiliation tactics, one of the things that was sent back to the Spanish, her troops cut off the testicles of one of the Spanish that were coming to fight against them, put them in something, and sent it back to the Spanish governor as a message of don't come back here trying to fight us again. That really enraged the Spanish. So they sent a larger force out against them at night to capture the Palenque. And the Spanish got very, very lucky. They probably would have been defeated again had it not been for a lightning strike that hit the completely by fluke. The lightning strike during the raid hit an area where they were keeping all their ammunition and powder and everything, and it blew up. And it caused a lot of fires and a lot of confusion in the Palenque. And in that confusion, the Spanish were able to effectively capture a lot of people, which they hung a lot of people and they exiled a lot of people. And Juana was in her 60s at the time of the raid in 1693, and they didn't execute her. In fact, the Spanish governor at the time had a portrait of her painted. Now, no one knows where that portrait is today, but apparently it hung in his office for like 20 years. And she was sold. She was exiled. So she wasn't hung like some of the other leaders. And that, again, that may have been a result of Spanish, gender perceptions, that she couldn't have possibly been the real leader. So there's no sense of hanging her. We'll just exile her to somewhere else. But again, another leader, incredibly successful, probably would have been even more successful had it not been for that fluke accident of the lightning strike. The descendants of these women, descendants of these communities, continue to exist and fight in Colombia today. You have Chadorina Hernandez, who is a palenquera who represents the descendants of those communities in Congress in Colombia. And of course, the vice president of Colombia right now is Francia Marquez, who's an environmentalist. She's a lawyer. And again, as a fighter for the rights of Afro-Colombian people. Colombia doesn't get a lot of attention as much as it should in Africana studies. And it is the third largest population of African people in the Americas. First is Brazil, then it's the United States, and then it's Colombia. So it deserves a tremendous amount of attention. There's a lot going on. The Africans are still fighting to control their land. Just like in Brazil, where you still have the remnants of Quilombo communities there. And these sisters are still strong. They're still fighting and doing their thing. So really important. Before we go to break, I do want to mention around this same time period, a couple of decades later, in the beginning of the 1700s, we got the story of Angelique in Canada. Again, not really 100% sure where she comes from, but she does at some point go through the Spanish and Portugal territories before she makes her way to New York and then ultimately to old Montreal. And her story represents the story of so many unnamed African women that were enslaved that rebelled in less grand fashion than the ones that we talked about so far, but rebelled nonetheless. These are the type of women that would use their mouth to rebel. They would talk back to their master and mistresses. They would uh, practice petite maroonage, meaning they would run away and come back. So they would take vacations from slavery and come back. They would, you know, of course, sabotage things, put glass in the master's food. If they were good at making medicines, sometimes they would make medicines for the master, and it's easy to turn medicine into poison. So they were often really good at poisoning people. These are the everyday acts of resistance that millions of African women practice, and we can't forget that. We can't just focus on the grand and the quilombos and the rebellions without remembering the everyday resistance. Now, unfortunately for Angelique, her everyday resistance resulted in her being executed for a crime that she never confessed to. Essentially, she was accused of burning down most of old Montreal. Um, she had been told so she was owned by this couple in old Montreal, and she was under the belief, whether she was told this or whatever, that when the husband died, she would be free. And she had also formed a relationship with an indentured servant. And when the master died, the mistress refused to free her. And this really set her off. So she became incredibly rebellious toward this mistress. I mean, the mistress was pulling her hair out trying to deal with Angelique because Angelique would talk back to her. She wouldn't do a task. She would run away and come back. And she even burnt down or started a fire in, I think it was a barn or something like that. She started a fire, one that she actually did start. A while later, another fire was started, and this fire got out of control and eventually spread and burned down a lot of old Montreal. And she was blamed for this fire. She denied it. She denied that she was involved until, under extreme torture and interrogation, she confessed. And everybody knows confessions after torture aren't admissible because anybody will say anything to stop having their legs broke and all the things that happened to her. And then she was ultimately hung. But the important thing about her and what she represents is that spirit of everyday African women. That even if they weren't able to make it to Palenques and Quilombos and Mucombos, they resisted. And they put that spirit of resistance in their children and grandchildren and everyone else in the community. And this book was done by, the great scholar, Afua Cooper, whose books and poetry and other things you can read. She's a great, scholar. I think she's in Halifax. So I'll stop there for a second and open up for any questions that we have before we go on. Any questions? See, David H put something really important in the chat, so definitely check that out. David H, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Lederer. For the women who were transported to the East as sex slaves or for the harems, and men were majority transported to the West, did the East not need the muscle to build?
Yeah. So again, they tried that, and then Basra happened. After Basra, they were like, we don't want to do this anymore.
Okay.
So
Okay.
essentially, they used them as eunuchs, but then there's also African men being used in military service as well. So not so much for labor, but for those two things, eunuchs
Got
and
it.
then being pressed into military service. And often as a result of both of not eunuchs, but the military service, many of them got their freedom as a result of the value. So the one thing about the one going east, it wasn't the chattel slavery that you see in the West, and it wasn't something that was necessarily passed down to the next generation. In some cases it was, but in a lot of cases, particularly the women, if they had children by their master, those children would be free for the most part. So they still have the stigma of their parents being formerly enslaved, and it was still anti-black racism in a lot of places, and still exists in Iraq and Iran and in Turkey and those places. But it wasn't like you're going to have this large population of people that have been enslaved for generation after generation. It was a lot easier to get out of enslavement in the East, whether it's through service or, in the case of the women, having children by the master, that type of thing.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments while we're in this part? I don't see anything in the chat. I don't see any answer. So I'll keep going. So another major area. So that was an example of the Spanish, and we could talk about more. There's the Africans in Mexico that had their own city and Palenque, and women were heavily involved in that. But for the sake of time, we're going to move from the 1600s into the 1700s and look more at what was going on in the English Caribbean. And a lot of the enslaved people from here that led rebellions are coming from what's now Ghana. And they are a result of course, the Europeans looking for labor, but also the expansion of the Ashanti Grand Confederacy that occurred in the late 1600s and really into the 1700s. So as a result of this empire building in West Africa, you got a lot of wars going on. And whenever there's wars, there's captives. And whenever there's captives, there's Europeans ready to buy those captives. Right on the coast, right at Elmina, right at the other castles in Ghana that were originally controlled by the Portuguese, and then later on went to the hands of the Danish and the Dutch and the English and others. So this is really important to look at this phenomenon, because this Grand Confederacy, although we can applaud empire, which I rarely ever do, but a lot of people like it. They like to say, oh, we had kings and queens in Africa and emperors and these grand empires. Empires are all built on exploitation. They're all built on exploitation and maintained on exploitation. So whenever you see the richness and all that of these folks, there's some exploitation involved in that. But the thing that interests us when we look at the establishment of the Ashanti Grand Confederacy is how it was organized. And one of the key features of this political system was the presence of the Queen Mother on every level. So, of course, at the top, you had the Asante Hene, which is the king of kings of the Ashanti Grand Confederacy. And then you have the Asante Ima, which is the queen mother of the entire Confederacy. But on the regional level, you have the same phenomena. You have the Ohenes and the Ohimas, the lesser kings and the lesser queen mother. And it's kind of like a pyramid thing. So when Africans are coming from this region as a result of the wars that are happening, they are bringing, and that political setup actually preceded the Ashanti Confederacy, because the Shira Kingdom was organized like that. This is the kingdom that the Ashanti leaders, Osei Tutu, rebelled against and ultimately supplanted and then expanded. So when all that's going on, Africans coming from this region are taking those political ideas, those spiritual ideas, those ways of organizing, and when they get free in the Americas, and many of them do, they recreate that. Because of all the warfare going on, again, many of these captives that are taken to the Americas, they have experience in battle. So when they get to the Americas, they resist, and because they're used to fighting, they resist, and then they form these communities. And we know that that Africans, when they get to the Americas, they come from this region by their names. They're known as Coromantese Negroes, Coromantee Negroes. These are Africans that come from this region. Just to give you an example of what we're talking about, this is the home area, and this is where it expanded to. So all this expansion is done primarily through warfare. Some negotiation, but primarily through warfare. And then again, all the captives will end up in Cape Coast, Elmina, and these places, and then transported to the Americas. One of the last major towns that they passed through was the town of Coromantee. So in European records, when they write about where these Africans come from, and they refer to them as Coromantee, Coromantes, these various names. And then we also know them in the historical record because of the cultural area that they come from, the Akan-speaking cultural area, there's only, there's 14 names. There's 7 names for men and there's 7 names for women. There's more names, but in terms of colloquial names, and it's Kofi and Kwame's and Kojos and Kwaminas and Quals and all these names that just keep repeating. So we know that they come from this region of the world. If you look at the history of enslaved African people in the Americas, you're going to see Coromantee rebellions and Mukombos all over the place. From as far north as New York, where Africans in 1741 burnt down New York City as a Coromantee rebellion. A lot of Kofis, a lot of Kojos, a lot of Kwames burnt down New York City. There's Tacky's conspiracy in Antigua, the first Maroon War, which we're going to talk about today, in Jamaica. You have Tacky's rebellion, which we'll talk about, Amina's rebellion, which we'll get into a little bit, the second Maroon War, Kwamina's rebellion in Guyana again. So there's Amina's rebellion, and there's Kwamina's rebellion, and these names just keep repeating because it's these Africans coming from the same region of Africa, and they're fighting. So really important. Yeah, just another example in Barbados. When the Africans revolted, they were going. The plan was, and we talked about this in Snitches and Sellouts course, they were going to install a king named Kofi. And that was their plan. And installment, again, these are these African carryovers that make their way into the Americas. So I won't spend a lot of time on that. I want to talk about one of the great scholars that we had that did this work, Dr. Lucille and Mithrin Mayer, who wrote The Historical Study of Women in Jamaica. She also wrote The Rebel Woman. These are great works that you can read if you really want to understand what was going on in Jamaica and how Africans from largely that area of the continent, and also there's a large proportion of Igbo Africans and Yoruba Africans in Jamaica as well. She writes great work. She wrote great works on these, and she lived from 1924 to 2009. So you can get these works, check those out as well. So probably the most well-known figure that came from that Akan cultural area, the Coromantes Negroes, was Nanny of the Maroons, who lived 1685, around 1685. Whenever you see the C, that means circa, we don't know exact date, to 1755. We don't know exactly when she died either. But she led the Maroons in Jamaica. And Nanny was the exemplar of that female leadership model that comes out of the Akan cultural region in West Africa. She's the only female national hero of Jamaica. All the other national heroes are all men. She's the only female national hero. And she's on the money in Jamaica as well. I can't remember which denomination. It's a $50 bill, the $10 bill, something like that. Somebody will tell me. When I talk about Nanny, I always talk about these 4 O's. The first one is the Akan term Opanyen, the Opanyen, elders, eldership. When Nanny first comes into the historical record, she's already old when we first find out about her. It's the English that are negotiating with the Maroons, and they talk about the Maroons' old obeah woman and the role that she plays in the negotiations and so on. That's Nanny. And she's already old. And throughout Africa, as we know, elders are incredibly respected. And same thing in Ghana. So we talk about the Opanyen elders. They're viewed as the embodiment of the past, as well as members with the largest store of memories from the past. Nanny was born in probably what's now Ghana, then transported to the Americas. So coming out of that cultural context, her being an elder in a position of leadership is not unheard of. In fact, it's expected. Africa, it's not like other places of the world where we just throw old people away, where old people just shut out somewhere. We bring our elders in. We make sure our elders have positions of influence, and we're able to learn from them. So Nanny represents that Opanyen. She represents the Ohima, that position of the Queen Mother. Nanny was consulted when it came to military tactics, political tactics, spiritual tactics, because she represented that position of Queen Mother of the community. It's very clear what she was with the type of template she's operating on as the leader of this Maroon community. The Queen Mother, when we talk about in Ghana, the Queen Mother may nominate a candidate from among the members of the Stool family in consultation with the Jesse Hani, the head of palace administration, and her relatives, but the nomination of a candidate remains her sole responsibility. So it's the Queen Mother that nominates the next leader, the next male leader in the economic, cultural, political situation, whether it's the Asante Hima, if the Asante Hene dies first, she's the one that nominates who's going to be the next Asante Hene. So Nani played that role. She ran things in the Maroon community. Although there were men in leadership, they were in some way subservient, not, I won't say subservient, but in terms of the actual role of things. And we can really say Ohimaz might have a little bit more power than Ohine's in a way, because they're the ones that actually appoint the Ohine. So really important position. The last thing I want to talk about with these O's, Os and Obia. Os and Obia. One of the ways the Maroon communities were able to organize and initiate new people into the communities and create that fighting spirit was the use of oaths. And we see this in rebellions throughout the Americas. Whenever a rebellion was about to be planned or happened, oaths were often taken. And Africans committed themselves to fight until death, to never betray the revolution, all of those things. They were often accompanied by rituals that included blood and sometimes gunpowder mixed together, and people would drink them. They would take oaths to never betray the revolution, to fight to death, all of those things. So oath taking was really, really important in all these rebellions, and we see it represented in Nani's struggle against the British as well. And of course, Obia, the idea of using African spirituality as a part of your political and military strategies. Obia gets a bad rap with a lot of people. And if you say it in certain circles, people look at you and think you're trying to do them some harm. Because for the Europeans, they understood the power of Obia. They understood that Obia was being used by Africans to rebel. Obia is a tool. It's like anything else. It's like a gun. It's like a knife. You can use it to liberate, or you can use it to oppress. And as a result of the fear of Europeans of Obia, now a lot of African people in the Caribbean, Afro-descendant people in the Caribbean and other places, when they hear it, they think that it's something of Satan. They think that, it's used by people to harm, innocent people, or people put Obia on people to harm them or their children or these types of things. But in this case, we're talking about the Obia that was used to fight against enslavement. The Obia that was used to fight against the slave master, to fight, to fortify people in their struggles against this inhuman system of enslavement. So that's the type of Obia that Nani used. She was one of the leaders during the First Maroon War, which lasted between 1728 and 1740. Just like we saw with the Palenques in Colombia, her troops used guerrilla warfare, hit and run tactics. They were experts at camouflage, the use of terrain, the fight in mountainous areas to make it very difficult for the English to come in large numbers, and they would pick them off, throw them off mountains. Camouflage to the point that the British would walk this close to somebody that was, covered in trees and this type of thing, and they would jump out and attack them. So all of these tactics, even using things like the famous Nani pot, this Obia pot, apparently, that boiled without fire. And the British would see this pot boiling, and it was kind of like near a cliff, and they would be so, entranced looking at it, like trying to figure out what's going on, that then the troops would pop out and throw them over the hill and the mountain and that type of thing. Her fighting, her installation of fortitude in the men and women that fought for the Maroon community was so strong that the British signed a peace agreement with the Maroon community. Now, this is where the history gets a little bit kind of fuzzy, because for some, they say part of the agreement that the British signed with the Maroons was that if any other Africans escaped, part of the agreement was the Maroons had to bring them back to the British, and the Maroons also had to assist the British in fighting against anybody else, any other Africans that wanted to rebel. And a lot of those Maroon communities did that. They worked with the British in order to maintain their own freedom. They worked with the British to fight against the Africans. But according to some historians, Nanny never agreed to this. She never agreed to this. And in fact, there's a split in the community that she was a part of, and many of them went to New Nannytown, where, and still under her leadership until she presumably passes away, that wouldn't agree to those terms of returning people back to enslavement or working alongside the British, that type of thing. So that's Nanny of the Maroons, really important figure, one that a lot of people know, and we're going to move on and talk about some other ones. Again, she's on the $500 bills. Again, I knew I had it there for a reason. And of course, if you go to Jamaica, you go to the National Heroes Park, you'll see a bust of Nanny there as well. All right, I want to talk about Tacky's Rebellion. It also happened in Jamaica. And this is about 3 decades later. Another Coromantee-led revolt. It happened on Easter. A lot of the revolutions and attempted revolutions that happened against enslavement happened on Sundays, happened on Easter, and happened on Christmas. Africans are smart. They observe the patterns of Europeans. When will Europeans be drunk, have their guard down, and then we can attack? So even one of the first ones, back in 1503, it happened around Christmas time on the plantation of Diego Colon, Columbus's son, in the island of Hispaniola. So this one happened on Easter. It covered several parishes. It was well organized. They killed about 60 whites, and it was organized by very influential Obeah men and Obeah women. Again, this is another one. Once it was put down, a lot of interrogation happened, a lot of questioning, well, who was involved, who was the leadership, and from those records, we find out the role of African women. And one of the most influential was Akua. Had this plan succeeded and they took over Kingston, Akua was going to be crowned as the Queen of Kingston. She was actually elected queen by the Africans. And the goal was to install her once they had finished their uprising. They talk about what she did at meetings. She sat in state under a canopy with a sort of robe over her shoulders and a crown upon her head. She was eventually captured. She was exiled to Cuba. But there's a really interesting story because she convinced the captain to turn the ship around and brought her back to Jamaica until she was recaptured and I think executed. But it's amazing the carryover. She sat under a canopy with a robe on her shoulders and a crown upon her head. That's very similar to, if we go back to the current Asante Ima. This is the current Queen Mother of in Ghana right now, Nana Kanadu Yiadom III. Look how she's sitting. She's always sitting under a canopy. She has a robe over her shoulders. She doesn't have the crown, but you have two of the same things that you see that was going on in Kingston in the 1700s. So you see these carryovers. They're not abandoning the political systems that they had back home. They're just using them in new ways in the new situations that they found themselves in. So again, Akua, the Queen of Kingston. So this is a good book that talks about this by Walter C. Rucker, Gold Coast Diasporas, Identity, Culture, and Power, if you really want to get into this a little bit more. In the rebellion in what's now Guyana, in Berbice, Berbice, excuse me, Berbice. It's Mr. Francis on, he always corrects me. It's Berbice. Now I know that. All right. 1763. Among the Akan, female counselors served as social critics who helped regulate people's behavior. No doubt, drawing on such customs, Amelia van Hollandia and Zeelandia, Kofi's sister from the Middle Passage, was said to have counseled him about people's loyalty. This information is found in a book called Blood on the River, a chronicle of mutiny and freedom on the Wild Coast, which was done by Major Lean Cars. This book is one of the few books that talks about this rebellion, which was almost a successful precursor to the Haitian Revolution. Had there not been some tactical mistakes made, we would be studying this like we study the Haitian Revolution. So this movement of all of these Akan Africans bringing these formats over from Africa, and even this idea of Kofi's sister from the Middle Passage, it's another thing that we see in the history of enslaved Africans. People that survived that journey together, they became family. If you were on the ship with another African, you were family. You were Malungos, shipmates, and that was a bond that people kept throughout the rest of their life. So the fact that his sister on this ship, they survived, they engaged in this rebellion against the Dutch, and they're forming this new society for the time being for the Dutch come back and reestablish order. She is his advisor because again, they're just going by what they did back home. It'd be like many of us if we were captured by somebody, some aliens or something, and we were taken somewhere else, and we had to decide, okay, well, we're free, so we need to figure out some type of leadership model. We might choose a parliamentary system or a presidential system or something that we're used to from the organizations that we've been a part of. Same thing with the Africans here. And again, what I'm stressing is the role of women in it. The last person I'll talk about is as a result of the Second Maroon War. The Africans that were taken from Jamaica to Nova Scotia, as well as the Africans that fought in the American Revolution against the British. And one of those women was Sally Peters. This is her husband, Thomas Peters. We don't have a statue of Sally Peters. But Sally Peters is an incredible woman. She lived a few decades after the events that we just talked about in Jamaica and in Berbice. And she was enslaved in Virginia, and she fought alongside her husband, Thomas Peters, for the British against the Americans. But not fighting for the British because they cared about the British, but the British said, we'll give freedom to any Africans that fight. So they fought against the Americans. And when they got free, they were taken to Nova Scotia, along with the Maroons from Jamaica that, as a result of the treaty signed at the end of the Second Maroon War, were also transported to Nova Scotia. These Africans would ultimately end up back home in Africa in Sierra Leone, and Sally Peters was one of the leaders of this community. She's alongside her husband, Thomas Peters, they advocated for African control over the territory. There's something crawling in my backyard. Advocated for African control over the territory. Advocated for the rights of Black people, both in Nova Scotia and in Sierra Leone. So very important figure, someone that we should know about. And this is actually going to open the door to our discussion about North America. So we'll stop there because we're going to pick up with North America next week. And also we're going to go back into the Caribbean because we have to talk about, of course, the Haitian Revolution as well. So that's where we'll stop today. And next week, like I said, we'll keep it going, and we might.